You might not know, but many Russian banks are not sanctioned. They still have access to US dollar clearing, they have access to SWIFT and many other global financial payment systems, which are still hosted in the US. So one can put all of these banks on the sanction list and just dedicate a couple of banks specifically for certain transactions, for example, energy transactions.
In the background of this conflict, this crisis, there has been and does seem to be this desire among those close to Donald Trump to reset relations with Russia, to bring Russia in from the cold politically and maybe even economically too. And if that is the plan, where does it lead? So let's now talk to the economist Elina Ribakova, who specializes in economic statecraft in Russia and in sanctioned regimes. Hello to you, Elina.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us on the program. Elina, give me your view on this. When Donald Trump talks vaguely as he has about imposing more and, seriously damaging sanctions on Russia, because so many sanctions exist and apply now, what more can be done?
Well, U.S. still has significant economic leverage over Russia, most importantly over the financial system. As you can imagine, you might not know, but many Russian banks are not sanctioned. They still have access to US dollar clearing, they have access to SWIFT and many other global financial payment systems, which are still hosted in the US. So one can put all of these banks on the sanction list and just dedicate a couple of banks specifically for certain transactions, for example, energy transactions. That's one. The second one is the shadow fleet. Oil price is now low, so it's a sanction by itself on Russia. But one could continue sanctioning shadow fleet of the Russian Federation. And that will turn them into basically Titanics, right? It's a multi-billion-dollar investment that will disappear overnight. And finally, the conversation about the reserve assets of Russia. Why should US or European or Ukrainian taxpayer pay for the damage that Russia has caused? Russian reserve assets can still be seized and used for this purpose.
Right. So there are tools within reach of the president. Now, when it comes to, let's just pick on one or two of those, Russia's still continuing to trade in oil despite embargoes and sanctions, using vessels that sail under other flags that are not Russian vessels officially. And as you say, they're the shadow fleets. Now, the G7 is meeting now. The G7 group of nations, the foreign ministers are meeting in Canada now. And from what we see, the American government is blocking a motion at the G7 talks which proposes taking on the shadow fleets and acting against the shadow fleets. So there does seem to be a profound lack of will in America, certainly right now, to do anything about that.
Well, the U.S. energy policy appears to be very multifaceted and sometimes contradictory. In a way, U.S. is a very large producer, is one of the largest producers in some categories of oil and gas, and also beginning to be an exporter, right? So in this way, it is a direct competitor to Russia. U.S. producers, enjoy relatively low break-even prices for production. It's not what used to be 10, 15, 20 years ago when they were just starting. Now the break-even price is pretty low. So it is a little bit puzzling. Why would they want a competitor to be successful on the market? However, if US doesn't move with it, UK and Europe can do a lot of damage to Russian shadow fleet, because in the end of the day, it goes around the European coastline.
Right. Now, what about trade sanctions? American trade with Russia, as I think I understand it, has already been reduced by something like 90%. It doesn't leave much space, does it? Trade sanctions now, or more trade sanctions, wouldn't do too much to further damage Putin or Russia.
Absolutely. The trade is absolutely minimal. It was already pretty low. It was European countries that were the most significant trade partners for Russia, and now it is China. So trade tariffs themselves are basically nothing. However, what the US can do is continue on the financial sector side, and also can tighten the regulation on dual-use goods, because a lot of dual-use goods still make it to the Russian military-industrial complex. Anything semi-sophisticated that Russia produces for the military is using Western components or Chinese components.
Well, let's just get your thoughts now on the idea of Russia potentially finding a place or rediscovering its place in the world economic markets. Is there, as we stand here, still a potentially valuable market for overseas investors in Russia if and when a peace comes?
Well, Russia is a large country, and some people say, well, it's 140 million people. But let's not forget that the size of this country is about the same size of a small European country, right? So it sounds good on paper, but in reality, it's not a big market. It is also not a growing market. And I think And people with nostalgia remember 2000s when emerging markets were booming and Russia in particular. But then oil price was first $13 per barrel and then $130 per barrel. It's almost mind-boggling to count what is the percentage increase of that oil price. And therefore, Russia was booming. And we have this, some investors have this positive associations, but it's no longer coming back. Russia is an oil play with a leverage. So that's why it's hard to see the opportunities. Maybe some companies, maybe banks will try to access Russia for some short-term trades, or maybe some car companies would like to sell something, but it's a very short-lived market. And we shouldn't forget that the foreign investors lost more than $170 billion just in this confrontation. Basically, the Russians have taken over their assets. And I think it's about more than 45 billion for the US alone.
Right, but there were a good many big brands, big corporate brands that left Russia after the invasion back in 22. Is it not, at least on paper, possible for them to go back in there and revitalize those markets?
Well, on paper, a lot of things are possible, right? But imagine you walking into your compliance officer's office or your executive board and say, "Look, darling, I've just lost a few $1 billion and I would like to go back." And who knows, maybe in 3 or 4 years' time, the U.S. administration changes and the sanctions will be on. Would you like to try that kind of risk reward? No, the compliance officer and your shareholders will tell you, no, this is ridiculous. Yeah. What kind of return you're planning, especially after the risks and the losses that were already suffered?
Yeah, there's also, I guess, isn't there, Elina, the small matter of the rule of law, the climate in which businesses operate in Russia. And, the law is a pretty flexible thing in Russia. We've seen companies get on the wrong side of the regime and they're made to suffer. That's going to be a deterrent to investors to go back in or go there and try and expand business, dealing with the regime.
Well, it's funny you should mention that because Chinese companies also worry about it. So Chinese companies haven't been active investors in Russia. There have been some projects with oligarchs close to Putin in energy sector and metals and mining historically. But if you look at the China's total portfolio outflow investments, Russia is less than 4%. So one could say, wait a second, U.S. companies are limited by sanctions and Chinese companies are picking up these opportunities. No, they're not. And in the service, they specifically say the unpredictable environment and lack of rule of law, Chinese companies saying is one of the reasons that they are wary of working in Russia. And of course, for anybody else, it will be the same. Also, there are limits now to how you can come back. Russian authorities have set up commissions that will be reviewing who will be allowed and how to come back to Russia.
Right, so if Russian dreams are to be fulfilled anytime soon, well, America does have cards to play. They can put a squeeze on that would still hurt, especially in the financial and banking sector. Equally, in those same fields, if Donald Trump was in the right frame of mind and the circumstances allowed it, America could make life a lot easier for Russia.
Absolutely. The U.S. has a lot of leverage that it can continue to put pressure on the Russia. It's ironic that over the last 3 years, we heard from Russia that sanctions are not working, but yet the first chip they put on the table that they would like to have removed are sanctions. This is what we heard in Riyadh. This is what we're hearing in the U.S. That's the first lobby effort that they put forward. So clearly sanctions are working. So there is a lot of leverage. And Russia is still a very small economy with uncertain outlook, unclear legal environment. The investors are not falling over to go back to that market.
All right, Elina Ribakova, really great to get your expert analysis there.